Brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, first of all, just want to thank the Tanyptera Trust for inviting me to speak to you all this evening. It's a lovely evening. The weather's absolutely fantastic. So I appreciate anybody who's decided to jack in the barbecues and come and speak to me instead. That's fantastic. I'm going to talk tonight about mosquitoes. It's going to be quite an introductory level. So I know there's a few mosquito pros out there who have tuned in. So you'll have to kind of just kind of tease through some of the earlier sections and then pick on my slides at the end. That's fine. But it's a subject that's quite close to my heart, as it is to quite a few entomologists. It's a topic that enters the news quite regularly, especially over the last few years, and we'll cover some of that as the talk progresses. But I would like to start I tend to start my talks just by, I usually leave the acknowledgements to the end, but I always put Anders at the start because if you don't know Anders Lindström or his work, he's a Swedish entomologist who works on mosquitoes, and he takes the most amazing mosquito photographs. And he's produced a book recently, which is a sort of a northern Palearctic book on mosquitoes, which he does, which is illustrated by him and Disa Eklof. And the visuals are absolutely fantastic. And I think my talks would be absolutely awful if it wasn't for the fact that Anders lets me use his photos. So yeah, go on his Flickr site, have a look if you're interested in his mosquito photography. They're a really good resource for people who are getting into mosquitoes. There are a whole bunch of mosquitoes there that are not found in the UK, but a lot of them are. And so there's some really nice material there for sort of direct comparisons. So yeah, first off, just a quick thank you to Anders for letting me rip off his images as I usually do. Thanks, Anders. There you go. Look at that. I mean, what a photograph for starters. There's no way I could replicate that at all. But yeah, so we're going to start off with a bit of a background introduction to mosquitoes. It's a funny thing, really, because you'd think, given the importance of mosquitoes globally, that most people would know what a mosquito is and what it is that they do and how their sort of life history works. But you'd be very surprised at how few people actually do. So we're going to start off with just a very quick basic introduction. And one of the first things that usually gripes me is, even though I've spent the last sort of 10 or 15 years working on mosquitoes in the UK, is the amount of people who come up to me and tell me to my face that there are no mosquitoes in the UK. It's the classic. They only exist on holiday, apparently. So for those who are doubters out there who think there are no mosquitoes in the UK, this is the current NBN distribution data. So you can see that there are plenty of mosquito records out there, and they are very abundant. In fact, apart from maybe in some of the upland areas that we have in the UK, mosquitoes are there are some species that are pretty prevalent across most of the country. So yeah, just to put that one to bed, the mosquitoes are definitely here, and they're pretty common across the UK. We have roughly 36 species in the UK. That does chip and change a little bit. The new ones are found, some are lumped, those kind of things. The status of some are very unclear at this moment. So we'll just go with somewhere around that figure, although it does change. And many of them are found in around human dwellings as well. So you don't really have to go that far in order to find a mosquito. Probably most of you get munched on them by them in the spring, and often in the autumn as well. And if you're lucky enough to live near the coast around our way, then you probably get fed on them during the summer as well. So they are in and around your houses. You don't always have to go that far to find them. One of the things I like to do is I like to collect unusual names, common names for mosquitoes. They have some really, really good names across the. I'm just going to move this out of the way because I can't see what they're. We have some really good names for mosquitoes across the UK and across the world, and sometimes they're worth just re-emphasizing. The word mosquito, as you may or may not know, comes from the word little fly, and the Portuguese and the Spanish both claim the origin of the name of the word mosquito. But yeah, it's where it comes from. It essentially just means little fly. But depending where you are in the country, you might know them called nudges. You might know them as moggies, mingin. I never know this is mingins or mingins. Maybe someone knows. I've always wondered how you actually pronounce this, but I've not actually been to Norfolk and spoken to people there to find out how you actually pronounce that local term. Boers or boovers if you're in the northeast of England. then these are my favourites. If you're in Scotland or Northern Ireland, I have had this confirmed by Northern Irish people. They're generally colloquially known as wee bastards or wee flying insect bastards, which sounds incredibly rude, but I've been told on good authority that is the genuine common name for them in those areas. Um, but in the UK, they've had all sorts of different names, and they've often been lumped in with general other small flies. So the name midge and gnat and conops and culex. And historically, when you go through old texts, they would have these names associated with them, generally speaking. And sometimes it's quite hard to know whether they're talking about mosquitoes or whether they're talking about non-biting midges and so on. They tended to get clumped together, but those names still do persist, and people still call them that. Around the world, there's some absolute corkers. So there's skeeter-teeters, swamp angels. Most of these come from the States, by the way. Galley nippers, gabbernappers, gallywhoppers, granny nippers. That's a nice one. Brass heads, mitsies, cousins. I like this one. This is one apparently comes from the deep south of America. Apparently it's because there's a lot of them and they always stick close together. So that's quite a good name. And so there's some really good, some nice, interesting common names. If anyone's got any more to add to my list, then please do, email me and send them over. I think there's some real nice ones. I like very local names for them. They also have a bit of a bad rap. Our perception of mosquitoes is not the best. And probably with good reason, to be fair. Globally, last in 2023 there was about 263 million malaria cases and 597,000 malaria deaths across 83 countries. Similarly, the dengue fever, which is now becoming more prevalent, 7.6 million cases reported the WHO last year with about 3,000 deaths. And interestingly, despite a huge financial effort to try and combat these problems, billions of pounds are spent each year to try and reduce the effects of mosquito-borne diseases. It's a fight that we are actually losing. These statistics are not improving despite the technology that we have over the years. Unfortunately, the number of malaria cases is growing, as is dengue fever. So it's not a war that we're winning. So the perception's understandably negative, I guess. Also, these are blood feeding species. We're not going to trick ourselves into thinking that there's something else. The majority of mosquitoes will feed on humans, birds, other mammals, and that interaction feeding between those groups often causes new viruses and zoonosis, which can be a problem. And also they tend to horrifically bite people when they're on their holidays and spoil people's jollies, which I get to hear about quite often. Mosquitoes in the UK. So of our 36 species, this was a report that was brought out a few years ago now by the European Centre for Disease Control that looked at a lot of the British species. And it highlighted those that we know of that are currently of higher risk of disease vectors. And of those that we found in the UK, those ones we are currently on the British species lists. And it's about 21 species. So 21 of the 36 UK species appear on the ECDC's rankings for maybe potential disease vectors. Now, I do want to emphasize that doesn't necessarily mean that we're a country that's riddled with mosquito-borne diseases. This is all about the potential and the importance of doing sort of work in and research on mosquitoes. So if you want to go out and do some collecting of mosquitoes and do ID work, then the chances of you picking up a mosquito-borne disease in the UK is fairly low. I've been doing this for a long time, as a lot of my colleagues have, and the only mosquito-borne diseases I've caught have been in other countries. So shouldn't be too bad. Now, we're going to rock on to identification because most of this talk is going to be about identification and backgrounds of particular mosquitoes of interest in the UK. Now, mosquito ID is a tricky business, mostly for mosquito experts, is because when people send us specimens to ID, they kind of look a little bit like this. Usually they've been splattered first, put in a jar, and then sent for us to try and identify. So they can be tricky, but it doesn't always have to be this way. You do not always have to splat your mosquitoes in order to identify them in the field. Some of them are doable. Some of them do require microscopes to do the identification, but we'll cover a bit of that as we go through the talk. So for those beginners who maybe you're not familiar with the group, You might work on something else, or you might be just with us for because you've got a broad interest. I'm just going to start with what actually makes a mosquito a mosquito. You have a nice picture of a mosquito here, and we can see that it has a really characteristic feature of a mosquito, and that is the long proboscis. This is the biting implements. This is the classic mosquito face, and yeah, if it's got a long proboscis, doesn't necessarily mean it's a mosquito, but it will certainly help you down that route. They also have a sort of a very hunched appearance. The sort of the Quasimodo of the insect world, which is very distinctively mosquito-ish, or there are some other groups that have similar hunches. But they also have these sort of long wings, and they're usually folded behind as when they're sat down, so that usually along the top of the abdomen, and they usually extend beyond the length of the abdomen, so they're quite long wings. And they usually have this sort of long, narrow abdomen. So if you've got something that has a long proboscis and is really wide and round and probably fluffy, then it's probably a bee fly or something else. That's not a mosquito. So it has this characteristic really long abdomen, which does tend to swell a little bit when it blood feeds. So you can see in this image, this one's is probably is not long had a blood feed. You can see it's slightly distended at the sides, and that's kind of typical. You can tell the sexes apart actually really easily in the field, and this is a really nice thing to do. And there are some differences between the two. Now, the key thing is that they have these plumose, what they call plumose antennae. So basically, the males have these big, fluffy antennae, and it's very distinctive, and it's very different from the females. In some species, they have these long, they have very long palps, and that's only in the males. But there are groups, as we'll come to later, where some of the females have palps, which is a long palps. So it's not a key characteristic. Despite them being the males and the fact that they don't blood feed, they still have the long proboscis. That feature doesn't disappear in males. So if you find one that's something that has fluffy antennae and no proboscis, it's something else. The male genitalia is often quite visible as well, and it usually extends beyond the length of the wing, as you can sort of see in this picture here. We'll cover that a little bit more. Now, let's see. I'll move that out of the way. There we go. So now, hopefully, this will work at your end. So this is a little specimen of a male mosquito, and you can see as you move along, the thing looks at the front looks like a big proboscis is actually the long palps, and they often run alongside the proboscis, so you can't always see it. But you can see those big fluffy antennae that are really distinctive. At the bottom of the abdomen, you've got these two long loby looking things, and that's the genitalia there. So this is kind of classic male mosquito territory. Oh, there we go. So this is a female mosquito, and you can tell because straight away because it's got this sort of short antennae. They've not got the big fluffy antennae. It doesn't have the sort of larger protruding genitalia. Oh, hello, seem to have frozen. There we go. There we go. And the palps are often shorter, but not always. We'll once again we'll come to that as we go through the groups. That can differ, but generally speaking, the females have shorter palps unless they're an anopheles, but we'll get to that. And just to add to it, I've got a lovely little 3D rotating female mosquito, so you can have a look. Little short palps there, long proboscis, and with the not quite so fluffy antennae as well. And if you go down to look at the bottom of the abdomen, around here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, then you can see that it doesn't have the long sort of distended male genitalia. It has these two little cerci, which are a lot smaller and a bit more indistinct. So that's an example of a female mosquito for you. There we go. So yeah, there's just a bit of a close-up from above so that you can see the difference between the male and female genitalia. And it's sort of a weird thing that we're focusing on the genitalia, but actually in the field, sometimes on the wing, you can actually spot the difference. I tend to know when I've got a male or a female coming towards the net just by the way that they fly. So once you get your eyes in, you can really see that sometimes those long palps that are in the males almost look like tridents when they fly along, and they're really quite distinctive. So actually, after a while, once you get your eye in, you can pick up these features like the distended genitalia and the big long palps and what have you. Um, the male genitalia is probably one of the best features for being able to identify mosquitoes down to species level. We're not going to go into the detail of how to use male genitalia in this talk because I think that that's a whole different session. And we have in the past for the Tanyptera Trust, we have run special courses on mosquito genitalia ID. But I think what we wanted to capture tonight was more the feeling of, how you can identify mosquitoes in the field, what level you can get to, that kind of thing. So we're not going to go into too much, but if you're really interested in the mosquitoes and you want to get your identifications spot on, then the male genitalia is usually a good way to go. So it's one of those sort of unfortunate moments where, you can make plenty of genitalia puns, that kind of thing. But they're quite different. They're quite unique in between different species. So, okay, let's have a quick chat. What isn't a mosquito? Is a good question. And it's one that people take for granted. So this is a little empid fly, or a dagger fly, or a dance fly, whatever you want to call it. And you can see it has the long proboscis. You can just about make it out there, which it uses for nectar feeding. But it's different. It's not the same as the mosquito. Oops, because it points downwards directly. With mosquitoes, proboscis point forwards. The abdomen is also a lot more squat and fatter. But yeah, that's the key. If the proboscis is pointing down, not a mosquito. If it's pointing forwards, then you're on a bit more of a winner. This is another one that gets commonly confused with them, the chironomids or the non-biting midges. Superficially, it's got the hunch. It's got the thin abdomen, looks a little bit like a mosquito. It's got the thick plumose antennae, looks like a male, but it's definitely not, in as much as it's missing that proboscis. Got to have that long proboscis, otherwise we don't want to know. Not a mosquito. It also has very short wings, so the wings don't distend beyond the abdomen. And that's another giveaway as well. Often the non-biting midges will sit with their front legs kind of pointing out, sort of up and outwards above the front, whereas mosquitoes tend to sit with their back legs raised rather than their front legs, which is another little bit of an indicator for you if you're in the field as well. Oh, this is the one that, weirdly, this is the one that we normally get sent that to identify to be a mosquito, and is typically somehow, I don't know how, crane flies with the daddy long legs, even the really huge ones. People send me photos of them and they send me them in the post, saying I've got a mosquito, and it's the least mosquito looking thing I get in my imagination, but for some reason people seem to latch onto this. But it's the same thing. It's got the short proboscis. It's way bigger than you're going to get a mosquito in the UK. I remember when I was running the insectaries at an unnamed university, and I had a phone call one night saying, "Tom, you've got to get into the mosquitoes have escaped. They're all in the foyer." And I was going, "Oh my God!" And this was about 9, 10 at night. So I hopped in the car, went down to the university, and went into the biosciences building, and the foyer was just filled with about 30 or 40 big, huge crane flies, and they had this huge panic on that these giant mosquitoes had escaped into the lab. So whether they thought we were breeding mutants, I don't know. But so it's actually surprisingly easy, and it's not just us. It's not just the public that make these mistakes as well. Some of you may be familiar with this franchise. The Jurassic Park franchise, famed for reproducing dinosaurs all around the world, which they have cloned from the mosquito DNA that they've got embedded in amber. Well, if you watch the film again, you'll notice that some scenes they drill it in and they extract as obviously it would still be liquid blood on a 60 million year old fossilized amber. And they extract the blood, and it is a mosquito. But actually, a lot of the shots, they've got a poor old tipulid stuck in the top of the cane that they've obviously, pickled this thing in resin, and you can even buy them, and from as replicas, and I think they cost about 160 quid or something. But you don't get a mosquito; you get a poor old tipulid who's been shoved in the top and added to a staff. Which I always find is a bit of a shame. So it's easy to mistake your mosquitoes for something else. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the mosquito life cycle. and I'll sort of trot through this in a particular order. And we're going to start looking at the blood feeding. It is absolutely only the females that blood feed in mosquitoes, and they require the blood feed in order to produce the eggs that they lay. And so they only do this for that portion of their life cycle. So they don't blood feed willy-nilly. They don't blood feed throughout their entire life. It's only when they're looking to produce eggs. There we go. And they have the mouth parts that are particularly evolved to achieve this. The chances are they were probably historically nectar feeders before they became blood feeders. We're going back millions of years here. Similar patterns have been spotted in things like moths, where they've predominantly come from nectar feeding to then become some species, believe it or not, have actually become blood feeding. There are such things as blood feeding moths out there. And what they do is, I think people think when they bite you, the whole of the proboscis, the big fluffy thing, goes into your skin, and that's actually not the case at all. Actually, if you look here, you can see this sort of little bend shape, looks like a U bend. That's actually the protective outside. It's like a sheath of the mouth parts, and that bends back and allows the bited mouth parts to come out. And the bited mouth parts are actually really complex, and it's made of multiple different mouth parts that, when you break them down, are actually the same mouth parts that you find in other insects, such as beetles. But they have slightly different functions. So some parts of the mouth are designed to kind of slice into you, and then there's another mouth part that comes out that then will detect the veins under the skin, and then there'll be another mouth part that then goes in and like a little hypodermic needle, and then drinks your blood. So they've got incredibly adaptive mouth parts, and the very delicate sensory organs on these mouth parts to help them achieve this too. So that's the blood feeding side of it. So they're egg layers. Well, I say obviously, not necessarily. So they're egg layers. They tend to lay their eggs on and around water. Not necessarily all groups lay on top of the water surface, but we'll come to that as we go through the talk. But they tend to lay them, on and around water sources. Things like open moving water is generally not in the area of comfort for a mosquito. They like very still water, stagnant water. There are some species that like very slow moving water. But each group has a slightly different strategy of laying eggs, and this is another way that can help you identify what kind of species you've got. They produce larvae. Once they hatch, the larvae appear. They have 4 instars, and what that means is that they have 4 different life stages where they'll shed their exoskeletons and they'll get larger and larger. And they're quite distinctive looking creatures. There are a few that look species that look similar, but they have these very round heads, which have these little antennae on the front. And some feeding brushes. So they often use these. Often they're filter feeders, so they'll use these brushes for moving water particles across their mouth, so they can filter feed. So they're actually quite useful in the ecosystem for cleaning water. There are some mosquitoes that predate other mosquito larvae, by the way, and there's a lot of research that's going on at the moment to see if they can be used as a biological control method. But most of mosquitoes generally are filter feeding creatures. They have a broad thorax. Once again, it's quite round. It's really chunky. It's almost like the hunched equivalent, but in the larvae form. And once you get your eye in, that's really distinctive. It's a really distinctive form on a larvae, and you can spot it quite a way off. They also have this sort of segmented abdomen with rows of sensory hairs that run along them, like little brushes. They're quite neat. And then really, for me, one of the defining features is this siphon. They call it the siphonal tube, and it's basically a breathing organ that's on the back of the abdomen there, which they stick out of the water surface to be able to breathe air. There is one British species, Coquilitidia ricciardii, which actually uses its siphon to stab into plants and is able to breathe oxygen through the root systems of plants. But most of the mosquitoes, they breathe on the water surface. There we go. That's a little picture there of Aedes larvae that's floating around there, and you can see the siphon tube at the top there sitting on the water surface. So they're quite. Whereas there's some fly larvae will be right down in amongst all the dank in the bottom. The mosquito larvae quite often at the top, and you'll see them floating around, so they can be quite easy to spot. Once they finish being larvae, they then they pupate, and when they pupate, they make these funky little things that look like a comma. There's no other way around it. They just look like a comma. It's incredibly distinctive. They have eyes. You can just make out the eyes. They're still able to move away from predators, and they have a little paddle on the back of the pupae, which they use to very quickly shuffle themselves out of danger. And instead of having a siphonal tube, they breathe through these things that look like Shrek's ears. They're the trumpets, so they've got the really. I quite like it. It's a nice name. I think it's very friendly. And the trumpets, you can see the picture on the right. They are on the water surface as well, much the same as the siphonal tube. And they have this distinctive thing. You can spot a mosquito larvae when you approach a piece of water because pupae, sorry, because they do this thing where they spin. And there we go. I think I've got a little video here. Hopefully that's decent of quality. You can just see. There you go. Whoa, you can see them shooting down. And the larvae do the same. They kind of wiggle around, but the pupae is really distinctive, like these little commas that are sort of tumbling away. Some people call them tumblers, which I think is quite a nice name. There you go. Yeah. That was just on the top of a water butt in the garden, and you could probably find this in the summer if you go and look in your water butts. So after a while, the larval stages, by the way, don't necessarily take that long. They can emerge within just a few days. Sometimes some species will overwinter as larvae, and same with the pupil as well. But more frequently, the pupae they can emerge within just a couple of days. And in some of the mosquitoes that respond to flood situations and monsoons and things like that, then they can complete this reproductive cycle incredibly quickly. So then they emerge, they pop out of the pupae as adults on the water's surface, where they can quite happily kind of float, and they can be there for for a few hours, whilst they pump out their wings to be able to take flight. And one thing that's interesting about mosquitoes when they've emerged, particularly in the males, is that the males are not sexually active for at least the first 24 hours of emerging. What happens is when they emerge from the pupal casing, the genitalia is actually upside down, and it very slowly rotates 180 degrees over about 24 hours. And once it's fully rotated, that's when they become sexually mature. And this male I've got here, you can just see that his genitalia is on the side. So this has probably only emerged sort of about 12 hours or so out of the pupa. And Anders, when he's taken this picture, he's probably taken advantage of the fact that this mosquito is still just preparing itself for its adult life, and it's probably just sat there just relaxing and chilling and trying to get its genitalia the right way up, as we always do first thing in the morning. So that's quite a nice key. So if you want to know how old an adult male mosquito is, and it's a nice little indicator of how old they are. So when they emerge as adults, the first thing that mosquitoes tend to do is they tend to actually go and have a nectar feed. So we often think of mosquitoes as blood feeders, but actually they spend more time feeding on nectar than they do feeding on blood. And so despite their bad reputation, these are probably actually quite significant contributors to ecosystem function and pollination. Well, the problem is that because 99% of research on mosquitoes goes on to their disease vector capabilities, their ability to pollinate, there are a few people who've done research on this, but we still know very little about their capability of pollinating. But you can see from the image on the right that this Culex mosquito here has got pollen all over its proboscis and some on its antennae. And there's another one here, it's just Anopheles. You can see it all up the side of the mosquito. So they probably play quite an important role in pollination, but we don't really actually fully able to quantify this. A recent study found that there was about 39 species of plants that we know that are likely being pollinated by mosquitoes. There is one species of orchid in North America, that is solely pollinated by mosquitoes, and so it's important. It needs the particular mosquito species for it to complete its life cycle. So there you go. Important nectar feeders. Who'd have thunk it, eh? Then there's the reproduction, of course, and really this goes back to this distinct nature of the male genitalia. They have a kind of a lock-in key mechanism in mosquitoes. So the gonostals, these loby-looking things, they're actually claspers, and once the males get hold of the female, they clasp and they don't let go, and they have very different ways of doing this. And very different ways of fertilizing the females. So they've evolved this kind of lock-in key mechanism. A lot of the species can be differentiated by the male genitalia. Worth to know. So how do you find a mosquito? I've put this up now because we're going to get into this a bit more detail to the mosquitoes in a second. They're surprisingly easier than you think, actually. If you like to do a bit of sweep netting, you'll probably find you get them in your sweep net. Once you sweep them, they're not particularly active. They kind of flop at the bottom of the net. Occasionally, they'll bumble up the side. So they're really easy to pot once you've sweep netted them, to the point that, just get your head in there. Don't be afraid. They're probably not going to feed on you whilst your head's in there. They'll be too worried about. You only have to sort of look at a mosquito and it seems to collapse. I don't know how they've become so abundant around the world, because frankly, if you look at a mosquito, it seems to die and fall to pieces. So, once you do the sweep netting, it's easy to stun them. It's easy to collect them. And you can sweep down in low vegetation. Often they rest on trees, in bushes. If you're on a wetland site, you get down to that deep vegetation with your sweep nets, and you'll probably come up trumps, no problem with the mosquitoes. And the nice thing with this one is that when you sweep in, you'll get male and females. You can dip for larvae. This is a picture of me when I was slightly less grey, with a white tray and a little pipetta, and I'm just dipping it into this ditch. And out they came, and that's it. And sometimes you can scoop up quite big numbers of larvae and pupae. The other method, and this is what the pros tend to use because it's easier to quantify how many you've got, is basically a small cup on the end of a stick. And I've seen loads of different variants of this one. A lot of people just tape stuff on, like a plastic cup or whatever, and they can just scoop in, and then you can reach quite far with the stick, so you don't necessarily have to sink into the pools to find your mosquito larvae. And the good thing about mosquito larvae is that they're very incredibly easy to rear. Pop them in a jar. If you stick an upturned bottle, a Coke or any other brand available bottle upside down, and then as they emerge, they'll go into the top part of the jar, the bottle, and then they'll be nice and collected for you there. And then you can just add a little bit of sugar water to feed the adults when they emerge if you want to keep them to have a look at. And if you're worried about your larvae, then you can just feed them a bit of fish food, very nicely finely ground up fish food. And you'll find that they can rear anything from a few days to a few months. It depends on the time of year and what species you've got. So always a good one, dipping for larvae. You can also attract a mosquito, no surprises there. CO2, so this thing on the right is called a mosquito magnet. These cost a lot of money. They were actually developed in America so people could have barbecues without being eaten by mosquitoes. But as a result, they've become a mosquito biologist's best friend, and they have a propane canister in the back. And basically, it burns off propane, which creates a warm CO2, which it pumps out in pulses, and that replicates breathing. So the mosquitoes are often attracted to mammal and human breath. So they'll come in, and there's a little fan sucks them into a bag. So you can use that, but there are other different kinds of CO2 methods that you can use as well. And pheromones. It's possible to buy pheromone laws now that bring in male mosquitoes. With this particular device, there's pheromone laws that you can attach to it so that you can try and get males and females. Mixed results I've had with the pheromones. I have to be honest, the CO2 bait works an awful lot better. And then for me, the most controversial but best bait is students and wives. I think is always worked well for me in the past. He's nothing like human bait, but I didn't say that. That's not unethical in some areas. I would definitely not do that in other countries. And what I mean, maybe shouldn't do in this country as well. I don't know. But yeah, if you have someone who's willing and you're nippy enough with the net, you can get the mosquitoes before they bite them. Then you can, there's no reason why you can't use a bit of human bait. The other thing you can do is you can use overposition traps, so egg laying traps basically. So when you've got female mosquitoes who want to lay eggs, they often mistake small black buckets for tree hollows, and dark pools. So you just have it's a black pot basically with no holes in the bottom. Obviously, fill it with a bit of water and pop a float in, a bit of polystyrene or a lollipop stick, and you'll find that mosquitoes will come in and they'll lay eggs on those floats and they'll lay eggs on the lollipop sticks, and then you've got your eggs that you can either hatch and rear them. Very difficult to identify mosquitoes from eggs unless you've got the right tools. So you can then rear them on if you're so inclined. So we've got major groups of mosquitoes in the UK, and they kind of break down roughly into three groups. There's the anophelines, the aedines, and then the culex and culesettes, which I've lumped together there, as people often do. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of go through those groups, come up with some really cool, interesting mosquitoes that are within each of those groups, and I'll tell you a little bit about how you can identify and separate those major groups really easily. So we'll start with the anopheles. So the first thing you notice, and bear in mind this is never always exact every time, but anopheles tend to stand at a weird kind of angle with their face pointing downwards like a dart. It looks like someone's thrown them and they're about to penetrate into whatever surface they're on. And so they'll often sit like this. Not entirely though, just to despite me, the first time you see an anopheles is bound to be sitting in another direction. But in theory, that's the sort of way that the general body plan is, they sit that way. So about 45 degrees, something like that. And they'll do that when they're feeding as well. They have, so despite my saying that females have short palps, generally mosquitoes, the anopheles is definitely the exception to the rule. And the females in anopheles have long palps, and that's a nice feature for you to be able to identify anopheles. But what they tend to do is, unless they're splattered in the bottom of your net, the palps tend to sit. They're very thin, usually quite fine, and they sit alongside the palp. So rather than being really obviously having these three, the proboscis and two palps flapping around, they usually looks like a really thick proboscis at one end. It looks like, I always think they look like something out of a Disney cartoon. And you'll see what I mean when we look at some of the other groups. Oh, here we go. Got another video. All right. So there you go. This is a little rotating video of an anopheles. You can see just at the front there that there's the prolonged proboscis and the two palps are the same length. In there, obviously you can't get the sitting angle in here. Generally speaking, they're not particularly scaly. They're generally sort of lacking in a lot of scales, although this particular species has got a nice little tuft of scales right between its eyes there. But it's a long proboscis that we're quite keen on. Long palps, sorry. Okay. There we go. The other feature, if you're unsure, is the roundness of they have the thing called the scutellum. So the scutellum just sits here in between the wings at the back of the thorax. And if you can spot this with cameras quite often, but in anopheles, this is a rounded feature. So you can see this is rounded. In the other mosquito major groups, they tend to have like three distinct sort of nodules. So sometimes you can pick this up, and this is a nice feature that also just confirms that you've got an anopheles, just in case you're not sure. And just to show you a bit more closer, this is a little video of an anopheles, and they have these setae that run along it, so it goes all the way along the edge. And they just like little knobbly things just here, but they would normally have setae in. Oh, I seem to have crashed. Come on, let's start you up. Oh, well, actually, it's sort of handy. It's frozen in a quite nice way that you can just see that roundedness just there. Oh, there we go. That's working a bit better. Fab. There you go. So you can see that rounded scutellum there just at the back of the abdomen, as opposed to this culecetta, which hasn't got the setae in, but if you look at it, you can see that there's a rounded bit, but then there's two lobes either side, and those little nodulary bits are not, it's not a full row all the way around. This is three distinct clumps. I hope you can all see that. But that's a nice feature that tells you apart. The larvae are also easy to spot because they sit horizontal to the water's surface, just like this here. And they still have some of the other features. So they've got the siphon is there, but it's very short, it's very reduced. And because it's so small, that's why they have to sit. If they had a really long one, it would push them down under the water so they can breathe. But because they've got a short one, they can conveniently sit along the water surface like this. So if you've come across a mosquito larvae and it's parallel to the surface, then you've probably got yourself a little Anopheles there. Their eggs are also quite distinctive. If you happen to find them, I don't think I've ever seen an Anopheles egg unless I've reared them in the lab. And they lay them individually, and they tend to lay them on the surface of water. And they have these little wings on the edge of them of the eggs. They're like a little float, and that helps them float, bob around on the surface of the water. And they tend to get really distributed and things like that. So they can be quite tricky to find unless you're rearing one yourself. Um, of the Anopheles, ones that are interesting, there are a few Anopheles in the UK, 6 or 7 species. But this is probably the group that takes the most interest, I suppose. And this is Anopheles maculopenis group. These guys tend to fly at night time. So if you want to see these, they might come for a nibble when you're at night. It's called a maculopenis group. There's actually 3 species in the group that are very difficult to identify apart. But for the sake of this talk, we're just going to lump them into the same one, Anopheles maculopenis. And they're quite distinctive as they have these sort of spotty wings. And the bottom picture on the right there is Anopheles with the spotty wings. And the one above there is Anopheles claviger, which is an Anopheles that doesn't have spotty wings. So kind of splits into 2. But if it's Anopheles, it's got spotty wings, it's going to fall into the maculopenis group. So that makes identification a lot easier. And they quite like to lay their eggs in they'll lay it in still water, I guess, but they like very slow moving water, so ditches, that kind of thing. The most famous, because they historically spread malaria in the UK. And there's still a vector of malaria in other countries, but in the UK, we no longer have the malaria, but we still have the vector, which doesn't bode well for us with the side effects of climate change. It's very much on the radar at the moment for the UK Health Security Agency and places like that, keeping an eye on what's happening with malaria in Europe, where it is starting to reappear. It used to be known as the ague in the UK, was a horrific killer of people for quite a long period of time. And there was quite a bit of work to try and track down which Anopheles species in the UK was responsible for the malarial outbreaks, and it was rested eventually on Anopheles atroparvus, which is one of the 3 in the maculopenis group. And this is a map of their sort of distribution, the general distribution across England. And then when you map it next to the historical cases of malaria, you can see that there's quite reasonably clear correlation between the 2. It's quite suggestive. And one of the reasons why I think it was such a problem is that we used to keep a lot of livestock very close to home in those days. And we've also considerably drained wetlands in the UK, and the climate has shifted historically as well. So for whatever reason, we no longer have the malaria vector, but the malaria parasite, but we have the vector is still here. Okay, so let's have a look at some Culex now. So moving on to the Culex group. This is a female that we've got in the picture here. They're a sort of medium-sized mosquito. The Anopheles are not too dissimilar in size to the Culex, to be fair, about 4 to 10 millimeter wingspan. So they're not massive, but they're a good size. You'll be able to spot them. Usually Culex are pretty boring looking, they're sort of brownish in color. They don't really have any obvious specific patterns. So in that respect, they're not, the most excited of mosquitoes, but doesn't mean they're not exciting biologically. Just to look at, they're pretty boring and brown. But the males are very distinctive because they tend to sit with their body quite parallel. As you can see from this image, once again, it's not every time, but in theory, they sort of sit with their bodies a little bit more parallel to the surface, and they have these upturned curling antennae. So you can see them there that they very much curl back on themselves, and that's quite a distinctive trait in male Culex. So if you spot a mosquito looking like that, there's a good chance you've got yourself a little one. Apparently, they also sit quite high on their legs, but I'm not entirely convinced on that one. And by that I mean they don't have their body low to the ground. But I've never been entirely convinced about that one. But if you really want a diagnostic feature for Culex, and it works for males and females as well, then they have this tiny little organ that's called the pulvili. and it sits in between the claws of the leg. So this image here is a leg, and at the end that's the very tip of the leg. And you can see that they have this little thing. I know it's basically like a little pad that helps it adhere onto different surfaces and things like that. But it's more developed in Culex than in other British mosquito groups. And you can just about see it. You can just about spot it, especially if you get under the microscope. It's that little white fluffy blob just there. And I have to admit, when I first started working on mosquitoes, I really struggled to see this for a long time. So I have got a really nice SEM micrograph that I did that shows it in much greater clarity. And it's this weird white looking organ there. You can see it's quite big, it's quite fluffy, it's got sort of sticky pads on the end. And there's a couple of other features there as well. So these are the claws. You can't really see them very well. They're quite small in Culex. I suppose if you've got sticky pads, why do you need claws, you know? And Odium, which is actually the longer white things there as well, which is a similar organ for attaching to things. But when you look at it like that and you see the fluffy thing in the middle of the claw, when you go back and look at the actual image, you can start to see it with a little bit more clarity. It's that little white fluffy blob. Well, that's a nice feature to see anyway, to look for. See if you can spot it. I'll be pleased if you're impressed if you can see it, but hopefully you'll see that quicker than I did. They also have a distinctive way of laying their eggs. They do share this with the Culicetes, but they tend to lay their eggs in rafts. So they'll put them together, and then the rafts are about 200 odd eggs, and they'll float around on the surface of the water. They can do so for quite some time until the conditions are right. Usually it's a temperature related thing. So there has to be warm conditions for so many days. And then the larvae will hatch and they drop out of the bottom of the rafts straight into the water. So they've got that protection, that lack of vulnerability. And I guess there's sort of safety in the cluster that you know, they're kept quite together. Potentially they're less likely to be predated. Maybe. Seems to work well for them. And the eggs, when they first emerge, they come out white, and the eggs will go a darker melanistic color. So they'll in after time. So if you find a little floaty raft like this in your garden, in a bucket in your garden, then the darker they are, the longer that they've been floating around for. These are another really nice photobanders of the Culex eggs and how they line them vertically. Fantastic, really cool. And the larvae look different too. So very different from the Anopheles, which is on the left that we've looked at already, that's sort of flat parallel to the surface. They have these really long siphons, so they're quite distinctively long. So they, as a result, they kind of hang down at an angle from the water surface. And so you can tell them apart really easily just from the fact they've got these long siphons. There are other features available, but we won't cover those today. So the Culex, we have 1, 2, 3 British species, three species. Yeah, 3 British species-ish. And probably the most famous of these is going to be Culex pipiens, also known as the brown house mosquito. It is incredibly abundant across the UK. And it's called the brown house mosquito because, first of all, well, it's brown. And secondly, you can find it in your house. So it's kind of appears in the house quite often, and it'll overwinter in there. You know, I mean, obviously before houses appeared, they were tended to use caves and tree hollows, which they still do today. So if you go and find yourself a little limestone cave somewhere and you go crawling through, there's a good chance you'll find over winter little Culex mosquitoes all sat on the ceiling and on the walls, and you can take some nice photographs like this. But they do also come into houses in the winter, and will probably have a little nibble of you given the opportunity. Yeah, so you can find their larvae really abundantly through the summer, particularly in September, in your water butts in the garden, and you can find them in really good numbers. Very common. Now, this is most famous, I guess, this species because it comes in. There's what they call 2 different forms. There's the form called molestus, which the name's a bit of a giveaway as to why it's called that, and a form called pipiens, and which is a pipiens. So it's Culex pipiens or Culex pipiens molestus. Now, technically, they're the same species, but they they're not necessarily subspecies, but they certainly have different genetic characteristics, and they have slightly different behavioral attributes as well. So the molestus form of pipiens will feed on birds, but it generally will feed on mammals and humans, whereas the pipiens form tends to feed mostly on birds, probably the occasional nibble of a mammal given the opportunity. The molestus form tends to feed indoors, so it doesn't like barbecues. Whereas Pipien's form tends to be more wild type. It tends to be found in woodlands, in those kind of places where it'll feed outside. Interestingly, the Pipien's form is actually most abundant in tree canopies, but you still get them lower down. Yeah, they also the molestus form tends to rest in man-made shelters as well. So they were originally found and described in the London Underground, where the commuters. I know we've got some London commuters with us today, and they know all about the molestus form of Culex pipiens, and so they've taken to living in places like subways. When you think about it, when you spend your time overwintering in a cave, it's only really a next step before you start living in places like that. But this is an interesting thing about their behavior and how they've shifted is that the wild type pipiens form requires the blood feed to produce its eggs, as most mosquitoes do. And it'll have a blood feed, it'll lay a couple of hundred eggs. The molestus form, it's been shown, can actually lay up to about 40 eggs without actually having had that blood meal. So it's almost sort of starting to find a way to adapt to those kind of the more difficult underground quite sort of conditions. So there's a little bit of difference between these, and it's quite a nice story. There's a bit of a sort of evolutionary thing going on here that people have really been researching for the last sort of 10 or 15 years. So there you go. So there's a good chance you'll get fed on by some of these in the spring and probably later in the year as well. That can be a problem. So in the UK, there are not really any known associated diseases with our British Culex pipiens, you'll be pleased to know. However, not that affect humans. However, there have been some ties with Culex and the outbreaks of avian malaria in some of our zoos. There's a few years ago, there was some cases of penguins that were dying in different zoos. And Culex pipiens was seen as one of the lead candidates for that particular outbreak, as long as potentially some of the little Culicoides biting midges as well. Yeah, so not necessarily such an innocent character. In other countries, not in the UK, they are known as a West Nile virus vector. You don't want that one, it's not a nice one. And they're also associated potentially with other diseases such as a Sutu virus, Rift Valley fever virus, Japanese encephalitis, Simbis virus, Tanya virus. So they are associated with quite a few things, but not considered a problem in the UK currently. So just keep that in mind. There's a nice little another Culex called Culex teratans, and I always add this one in because it's my favourite mosquito. I call it the frog muncher, but I don't know what other people call it. And it likes to feed on frogs mostly. So just to celebrate that, I put a picture of a toad in because I only had a picture of a toad. This is one of Anders' pictures that I've stolen. But they're easy to identify from the other Culex, even though they look the same in the picture. If you look at the abdominal segments, it has the white bands at the bottom, whereas Culex pipiens has the white bands at the top. So actually, if you get some nice pictures or you can get one under a microscope, you can identify them pretty easily. Quite rare in the UK, the frog munchers. I've spent years looking for them, and the only place I've ever found them is in the Cairngorms, where they obviously like Scottish frogs. So moving on to the Culicetes, one of the other major groups. We have got two subgenera, and they can be quite different. There's the Culicellas and the Culicetes. And we'll have a quick look. So the Culicella, they've got one here, the Culiceta morsitans. They don't have the upturned palps. Superficially, they look a little bit like Culex, but they don't have the upturned palps. They stick very much forwards and they're a bit bushier. They're a nice looking thing. And they're a medium to large kind of pale brown mosquito. They're a bit bigger than the Culexes. They will also have a nibble at you given the opportunity. And the females have these kind of white knees, which is quite characteristic of the Culicellas. So you can spot those easy enough if you take some pictures. The Culisetas, they can be, this is the other subgenera, they can be confused with the Aedes mosquitoes, which we'll have a look at in a second, because they're kind of a little bit, they're sort of a bit larger, they're patinated, they've got lots of scales all over them, they have these banded legs, so people can confuse them easily with Aedes, but there is a get around for this. And to do that, we have to look at the side of the mosquito, which is quite a complex sort of feature in itself. But we have the eyes, and they have these two spiracles. Now you tend to use the spiracles to help coordinate where you are on the side of a mosquito because they do vary a little bit. But what we're interested in, hang on, that's the abdomen there, sorry, and those are the legs. I chopped those off for the illustration in case that wasn't very clear. But what we're interested in is the red splodges and the blue splodges. So the blue splodge is called the pre-spiraculoceti because they're just in front of the spiracle. And then the red splodge is the post-spiraculoceti. These are the hairs that grow after the spiracle. And these are really key. So what we're interested in, so for Culisetas, they have their hairs before the spiracle. So there you can see on the picture there, little row of hairs. You have to be careful to make sure that you are looking at the area just before the spiracle. But that's a good guide that tells you that you've got a Culiseta and not an Aedes. The larvae, again, are reasonably distinctive. Well, very similar to the Aedes, I guess. They do lay floats like the Culex, but they have, oh, there we go. There's some our other larvae, but it has a sort of broad, fat, short siphon rather than the really long, slender one. And because they're very big mosquitoes, they have really big larvae as well. So yeah, this angle at the surface as well as the Culex. Probably the most famous of this is the banded house mosquito that we have in the UK. Another really common one, Culiseta annulata. This is a great thing, this. It's massive. It's Europe's largest mosquito, is my understanding, or someone might tell me otherwise. And it has these really distinctive banded legs, and we get sent these all the time, getting told they're Asian tiger mosquitoes, but they're not. They come into like Culex, they'll come into your house and overwinter. But the really feature is if they've got big banded legs and spotty wings, then this is what you've got. You've got your banded house mosquito. Those spotted wings are kind of key. Yeah, they overwinter as adults like Culex, so they'll come into your house. They're in a very similar habitats to Culex in that respect, Culex pipiens in that respect. And I've got a little video. So you can see there, look at those lovely banded legs there. So on the fibia and the tibia, you can see these white splodges, and that's really indicative of Culiseta annulata. And as it kind of rotates around, you can see those big spotty wings. Ah, fantastic! Look at them, brilliant. So there you go. This species will also have a nibble, given the opportunity. In the UK, it's not particularly known as a disease vector, but in other countries it is, particularly in Asia. Tanya virus it's also plasmodia in birds potentially. So that's malaria, sorry. Equine, various horse arboviruses, myxomatosis it's been linked with. I don't think that's ever actually been proved. West Nile virus, those kind of things. But in the UK, it's not seen as a particularly high risk, and it's not by the European Centre for Disease Control. Okay, let's move on with these. I'm very aware that I'm really waffling. And we've gone through an hour, so we've got a little bit left to go, but not far. Okay, so let's have a look, talk about the Aedes in the UK. This is the largest genus in the UK. It's about how many Aedes have we got? 17, 18, something like that. So there's more species of Aedes generally than there are of the other mosquitoes. And they come in a range of sizes. They range from teeny tiny to reasonably large. But some of them have very distinctive patterns, like this one, which is Aedes geniculatus on the left. But some of them don't. Some of them can be quite dull. So just bear that in mind. So how do we know if we've got an Aedes? Well, we can look at the CTs again on the side of the body. And instead of having the hairs in front of the spiracle, they usually have a cluster of hairs after the spiracle. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, to get to tell between species in Aedes, one method is that you can look at where the hairs and the scales are. So often they have these big, they're quite scaly creatures. They can have these lovely white scale patches all over the sides, and where they are and how extensive they are can be characteristic for telling the species apart. So it is possible to do some of these via photographs. Um, and the more experience you get, the easier you can get your eye into these kind of things. But we're not going to go into that level of detail where we look at the differences between. But just be aware, if you want to get into mosquitoes, those can be key features to kind of look for. Also, the presence and absence of leg banding that can help you split which Aedes you have. Not all Aedes have banded legs. Some of them don't. This is Aedes rusticus here, and this one don't. And this one's Aedes flavescens, and it doth. So yeah, so it just goes to show you can. That's a very coarse way of helping you split between the Aedes groups. Keys are available, as I'll get to later on. The males have the long furry palps, and they can have all different shapes and sizes. They can be quite variable in Aedes. They still have obviously the plumose antennae as the males do. Yeah, there you go. And the females, they have the sort of skinny antennae. Oh, what have I put in there? I can't read what I've written. My own writing. Hang on. Oh yeah, short palps. Yeah, so Aedes females tend to have the shorter palps. So that's quite distinctive. So you know that you've not got an Anopheles, but equally you could also have a Culex or a Culecetta, which also have shorter palps. Again, the larvae is trickier to tell apart from the Culecettas. They do tend to have shorter, broader siphons. Um, um, some people say that they'll dangle more vertically than the Culecettas, who sort of are a little bit more closer to the surface. But they can be quite tricky, particularly if you've got a larger species of Aedes. Sometimes you know they can be difficult to tell apart in the field. In which case you need to pop those out, get them under the microscope, and there's different CT features on the siphonal tube that will tell you what you've got. But it's a rough guide. Yeah, once you get your eye in, yeah, you kind of get a feel for it. But yeah, that's the kind of the key difference by eye. Now, the key thing, I guess, with Aedes, and one of the reasons why they're probably such a successful species, is the way that they lay eggs. So they tend to lay these sort of singular eggs, like Anopheles do, but they don't lay them on the surface of water. They actually lay them on the margins and on vegetation, sometimes in soil in areas that are going to flood. That's because their eggs require a diapause, so they have to be dehydrated for a while before the embryos can fully develop. And you think that's an interesting strategy, but this is one of the reasons why when we get really heavy rains, we suddenly get annihilated by mosquitoes, particularly in other countries. Oh yeah, there we go. So they're often associated with temporary water bodies, but not always. They can just be on the margins of pools as well. And this feature is probably most famous in this mosquito, which is called Aedes albopictus. This is the Asian tiger mosquito, which is the one on the right here. You've probably heard about this one. And it is famous for laying its eggs by attaching the eggs onto a surface. So what it does is, this is a section of a car tire from some work that we were doing on these particular species, and you can see this dark ring, which is the actual eggs of the Aedes. They've been very successful at spreading themselves around the world via the second-hand car tire industry, where in countries where they're more prevalent in the near tropics, they will lay their eggs whenever there's water that falls into a bit of a tire, just like in picture A there. And then once it dries out, it's left with this ring of eggs, and they're just sat there they're in diapause. They're not going to do it. They ain't going to die. They can survive for quite a few months in this condition. And then they get shipped around the world. And then when they're dropped off somewhere, they're usually dumped outside, and it rains, and then the offspring emerge, and then you've suddenly got an infestation of Asian tiger mosquitoes you didn't even know you were going to get there. And they've been particularly good at spreading themselves around the world using this method. The eggs are adapted. This scan electron microscope image on the right, that's the surface of an albopictus egg. And I coloured the blue bits in so that you can see these are like a sticky surface that they produce, and they're able to sort of secrete like a mucus, and you can just about see it on the right here. That's what this kind of, so that they can attach themselves onto the surface of things, and they can do that very efficiently. Um, yeah, the Asian tiger mosquito. Second-hand car industry introduced, second-hand tire industry, sorry, introduced accidentally Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito, into Italy in the mid to late 90s. And subsequently, they've moved their way across Europe. And this was 2012. And then the most recent maps from the European CDC, the red areas show where they are to this date. So you can, yeah, the orange is where they've not established, but they've been found. So you can see that they've been moving exponentially. And the interesting thing is that people are starting to question, well, hang on, these things are moving rapidly across Europe. There's no way this has just been through the second-hand car trade, because you would imagine they would appear in pockets rather than a sort of slow amble. But yet Aedes are notorious for moving about 100 meters from where they emerge, so they don't travel very quickly either. But yeah, we've seen in just a handful of years these species spread all the way across Europe. And some studies in Spain found that they started vacuuming cars to try and work out how they were moving around. And what they were finding was that the tiger mosquitoes were hiding inside the crevices of people's cars. And then they'd be driven somewhere, and then they would feed on whoever was driving, usually, and then they would emerge, and then they'd lay their eggs wherever they were dumped, wherever that person stopped. And this is probably the main cause for them finding their way across Europe, basically hitchhiking their way without permission. A lot of surveillance work was done in the UK, is still ongoing with the UK Health Security Agency, that looks at all the ports and service stations and things in the UK, airports as well, to try and pick up Asian tiger mosquitoes these are essentially knocking on our door now. And in 2016, they were found in an oviposition trap in a service station in Kent. And chances are, and then for subsequent years, we also found them there. Yeah, the chances are that they were hitching rides in the back of people's wagons who were coming over from France, and then they were emerging as predicted and laying their eggs in the oviposition traps, little black cups with some polystyrene in. That's all it took to find them. We don't think they've established in the UK that we know of. And the monitoring still continues. They were found for subsequent years, 3 or 4 years after this, and then during COVID they weren't found for quite a while. But although searches were still happening, and last year, I think it was last year, was it the year before? I've lost track of time. There was some found again in service stations. So they are on the move. There's a lot of headlines now catching this one. Evil Zika carrying mosquitoes are going to launch attacks on Britain. They didn't, as it happens. But, look, being a realist, this thing's moved away across Europe. It's knocking on our door. Within the next 10, 20 years, it probably find a way to get established here. That's the depressing truth. And every country that it's accidentally been introduced to, they've never been able to control it or eradicate it. And this is a problem because they are very well-known competent vectors of dengue fever, Zika virus, chikungunya, yellow fever. You've probably heard of those ones. And this is the number of local dengue transmissions in Europe. So yeah, we actually have local dengue fever in Europe now. And if you look at this table, 2010, France and Croatia, there had several cases, not huge amounts, but small numbers. And last year in Italy, there were just in Italy alone, there was 213 locally transmitted cases of dengue fever. So this is going to be a big problem in Europe going into the future, and it's a problem that could happen to the UK. So keep your eyes peeled for Aedes albopictus. These are the countries that have now had dengue incidences, with the likely vector being Aedes albopictus. There's a few other invasive Aedes as well. I'm not going to go through them in any great detail, but the way you can separate them is by the patterns on the thorax, and they're very subtly different. You can see here that Aedes albopictus have got this lovely big white stripe that runs along the thorax. There are some mosquitoes that look a little similar, so if you think you found a mosquito with a white stripe up its thorax, by God, you send it to me or to the UK Health Security Agency and we'll have a look at it, or to the Natural History Museum, send it to one of us and we'll have a look at it for you. But yeah, so subtle differences in the patterns on the thorax can make a difference. There's a really nice guide on the government website that can help you identify these mosquitoes. So I would suggest doing a Google search because there's loads of literature on how to identify these guys. There we go. There it is again. So there's a few other interesting Aedes, less diseasey in the UK, that you might come across. So this is Aedes cantans and Auranulipes. They're very similar, difficult to separate in the field. This thing is a medium to large mosquito. It has banded legs, beautiful banded legs, and it will annihilate you in British woodlands, particularly in the north. Most small clusters of woodlands in the northwest of England are absolutely riddled with Aedes cantans. And as you move a little bit further north into sort of the Silverdale way, Aedes annulipes is the real common biter up there. And so if you see a big bandy-legged mosquito that's not got spotty wings and is ferociously feeding on you in a northern woodland, there's a good chance it's probably one of these mosquitoes. So one to keep an eye out for. Yeah, they're the bane of a lot of dog walkers, I think. Another couple of interesting Aedes is Aedes detritus and Aedes caspius. These are quite abundant on our coastlines. Both can take quite brackish water conditions, so salt marshes, that kind of thing, are big on these guys. You know, they can appear in huge numbers when the season is right, and they're reasonably easy to identify. Aedes detritus doesn't have any bands on its legs, and it has this kind of speckly abdomen that you can see here, so that it's sort of reasonably distinct. It has white bands at the base, but quite speckly. And that can appear in big numbers. Aedes caspius has white jointed legs, and it has this beautiful ginger and white thorax. It's really quite a striking thing, actually, I think. And they both live together in similar conditions, and both appear in huge numbers. Now, I want to really emphasize the work that Michael Clarkson and Peter Venevolson have done on the Wirral over the last sort of decade or so, where they've been carefully monitoring the populations of these mosquitoes, where they appear in huge numbers. And they've come up with some really interesting data. And what they found here, this is for Aedes detritus, this particular graph. And basically what they've shown is that here is that they like to stick, they'll stick close to the traps, so less than 200 meters from from the pools of which they emerge. They also have been increasing in abundance for some reason that we're not entirely sure about, but you can see into 2023 there were significantly higher numbers of trapped Aedes detritus that year. And what they've done is, which is really nice, is that they've actually working with the local council there to create an alert system for local people, so they know when biting is. There's a good chance the mosquitoes are going to be out and they're going to be biting. So they've got this traffic light system. So the coloured peaks are the bite reports. So that's the red ones. And that's versus the blue ones, which is the numbers that they've trapped. And what they can do is map these together and then do like a traffic light system that predicts when the highest number of bited mosquitoes is going to occur. And then they put this on the council website, and there's an alert system. So if people are having a barbecue one weekend and they can go on here and they can say there's a high chance you're going to be annihilated by Aedes caspius this weekend. So, you know, don't put your shorts on, put your pants on, that kind of thing. And this gives you an idea of where the location. So they've been mapping where all the biting reports have been coming from this part of the country, and they've got this lovely map where they can see where the problem areas are. Yeah, there you go. So there's the council website, Neston Town Council. They've got this lovely traffic light system. I think it's really smart, and unfortunately Michael Clarkson is no longer with us, but Peter Venevolson is still furiously going out there, and he goes out more or less every week and counts the number of larvae that in his pools and what stage of development they're at and that kind of thing. So he's, you know, the service he's providing is absolutely fantastic. All right, so that's kind of the gist of the breakdown of the British mosquitoes and what we have. There's a lot more species and that I haven't really got into, but there are species that are considered scarce and threatened in the UK. Believe it or not, they are included in the conservation agendas. And the bottom one there is really nice, Orthopodomia pulchripalpis. It feeds on birds, but it lives in tree hollows, very rarely comes down, and it mostly lives in Epping Forest and the Queen's Estates in London. So it's obviously got a high society mosquito, but quite a rare one. And there's a few that are data deficient. We still don't know a huge amount about British mosquitoes. So if people who are keen to get involved in doing this kind of thing, then I encourage you to do so. Any records we can get for mosquitoes is really useful. There's some additional reading material as well that you could go for. Yeah, there's Cranston there on the left. That's the classic British book. It's a little bit out of date now, but it's still usable. I would certainly recommend the one in the middle, which is Norbert Becker's European Mosquitoes. There's some really nice keys in there. Very, very good. It's not that cheap though, unfortunately. And Anders' book, which is beautifully illustrated, if you can get it, it's not as easy to get anymore. It's definitely worth buying. But this is free to download. So if you Google search the Wetland Mosquito Survey Handbook, in there at the back, there's keys to British mosquitoes and a whole heap of information, way more than I've given you tonight. It's a really nice piece of work that's been done. And it's free to download. So I really suggest that you get your hands on that. Woo! I'm finished. Oh, to take a breath. Sorry, guys. That went on for much longer than I thought. But yeah, just as usual, thanks to everyone who's we've worked with over the years. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. That was an excellent introduction.
The problem you've got is, Gary, is it's just such a huge topic, even the British ones, and all these mosquitoes are so fantastic. Individual species have such interesting natural history, and you have to cherry pick. It's difficult, you know.
Yeah, spoiled for choice, really. There, I mean, I really just love hearing about the ecology of these things, but also, I mean, when you covered a lot of ground there. I need to speak to you about those specimen videos. They're really good. They
Oh
work
yeah,
really well.
yeah. Then they looked okay rotating because
Yeah,
earlier on.
yeah. And it just gives you a better grasp of what you're looking at, I think, and the shapes of things from the different angles. And yeah, electron microscope images as well. That Pulvilli was excellent.
No worries.
Super,
Yeah,
super
I'll show
good.
you how to. I'll show you. Yeah, it's good. It's quite fancy, isn't it?
Yeah, really nice. No, that was really interesting, Tom. So yeah, it's kind of if you're happy to take a few questions, I know it's like 10 to 9 already now.
Yeah, I know. I'm not in
But
a rush. I mean, I'm slowly getting darker here. Hang on, I might be able to put the light on. Whoa, no, I'll switch it off now. Yeah, sorry, please do.
yeah, so we have a question in the chat from Dave Boulding. Are any mosquitoes immune to insect repellent?
Oh yeah. Oh, it's a nightmare. Yes, yes is the answer to that. They're incredibly able to adapt to any kind of insecticides and repellents that we produce. It's unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why we are failing miserably in our control methods globally for mosquitoes. They're quite prolific breeders, but they're also very, very adaptable. And yeah, insecticide resistance and resistance to insect repellent is a big problem. A lot of if you go on holiday anywhere or traveling or whatever, just always use whatever the locally recommended repellent is, because if you take the stuff from the UK, what is it? Who knows whether it will work where you go? There's a chance it probably won't. But local people tend to know what works best in their areas. That's my recommendation. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tom. At this point, I just like to list off a few things coming up with Tanyptera in May. Leanna's already said really, but just to remind you, we have the first invertebrate recording day at Beacon Country Park near Skelmersdale, huge place, really varied, on the 9th of May. And then the next Friday is Cross Hill Quarry, which is near Clitheroe, in Lancashire, Friday the 16th of May. Then on the Saturday, we've got an introduction to bees workshop at Nest Botanical Gardens. And then Monday the 19th, we had Erica talking about fly pupae on another webinar. And also in May, on Friday the 21st, we have a Hightown Dunes and Meadows invertebrate recording day. So lots to look at in May. And Leanna's just put a little link into the events page on the Northwest Invertebrates website. So I'm just going to look for any other questions that have been put in the chat.
Oh, the Jurassic Park thing. It still makes me angry. I love that movie from my childhood, but I can't. Oh, drives me mad.
Oh yeah, so and Eric has put in some information for London Underground Mozzie. There we go. So does anybody else have any other questions? You can unmute yourself if you like, and just speak your question. Otherwise, if no one does, I wanted to ask about malaria actually, and
Oh yeah.
why we no longer have parasites but still have the vector.
Well, I think that's still. I mean, if Erica's around, she might know more than me. But as far as I'm aware, we don't really know 100%. But there are several theories, and we think it's a compounded thing whereby it was systematic draining of wetlands. It was the change to the way that we had houses, so we stopped having thatch housing, thatch roofing. We stopped keeping livestock close to our homes. Those kind of things, as well as a shift in climate. There's some other theory I've seen about how the Little Ice Age may have finished off the Plasmodium parasite from the UK, and it's just never really found its way back in. So there's quite a lot of different theories that float around about it. We only had one of the big quick questions has always been what kind of malaria we had, because there's several different kinds of malaria parasites, and the current thinking is that we had the Plasmodium vivax, which is the malaria. It's the most common malaria, as my understanding, but it's the one that can hang around in your liver for like 20 years or something. But it was known, I mean, there's all sorts of awful stories, particularly in Norfolk, of cases of malaria. And there was one sort of famous story about a farmer who used to bring his wives in from London. He used to get his wives. Sounds awful, doesn't it? He always used to go for his wives in London, but whenever he'd bring them to Norfolk, they were always dying from malaria. And I think he had like 5 or 6 wives, and every single one died of malaria within a very short period of time. But he was tolerant to it because he'd been exposed to it, presumably. So would his ancestors. And but yeah, real struggles. People who weren't used to it would just drop like flies, I suppose. Yeah, so it's quite interesting because you don't really associate mosquito diseases and the UK, but it was very much hand in hand at one point.
Yeah, hopefully won't return in our lifetime, but it's a bit concerning, isn't it? The spread.
Yes, yeah. It is because we travel more as well. So people coming back from, their holidays, you'd be surprised how many people come back from traveling with malaria and with dengue fever. And it doesn't take a huge amount for these parasites to find their way back into the system. So, particularly with climate change, the way things are warming, there's no reason why malaria won't rear its ugly face again at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So, Rasmus has put into the chat, pinning always from below. Is that a question?
Well, that's a very good question. That is what I tend to do nowadays. I mean, when I first started getting to them, I used to find really elaborate ways of pinning them from the side so that I could protect the legs better, and so I could see every angle and all the rest of it. But yeah, it just turns out for me the best way is just turn it on its back and pin it from below, and then stick it on a little foam stub. Yeah, that's the little foam strip. Yeah, that works. That works fine. Unless your mosquitoes are dry, that only works if they're fresh. Because the thing with mosquito specimens is that as soon as they start to dry, everything just falls off: legs, antennae, heads, abdomens. They just you look at them and they fall to pieces. So if you can't do it when they're fresh, then I would just card point mount them. So just you glue them onto little triangular points.
Hi, Tom. Can I interrupt?
You certainly can. Go on, Erica.
You know I'm going to interrupt with this one. Lovely talk,
one?
by the way. Superb. So the reason why we card pointed them, though, a little bit was we were able to spread their legs ever so slightly. and spread their wings to kind of get to look at what was underneath. So a gentle little pressure. So we inverted the card, we put the mosquito on its side, and we kind of splattered the mosquito ever so gently to kind of splay it. So that's why we card point.
There you go.
Oh, nice. But if you're
Thanks, Erica.
Hey,
if you're pinning from below, then are you not then having to put the labels in with the blunt end, going through the labels? And if you have to put any new labels on,
Well, usually, so it's sort of the classic Diptera mount. If you do decide to pin from below,
oh,
then
you're doing it onto your stage. Okay, you're not direct.
I usually just do. Well, I would normally do it on a bit of, if I was pinning from below, just upside down, a bit of plasters out.
Oh yeah,
So that it's a bit
staging.
more gentle on the thorax because they lose all the scales as well. I mean, Erica's right. I guess if you point mount, you have less risk of things falling off when they're fresh as well. So it's not it is a good strategy, but you can pin from below. That is the old school way of doing it. Yeah. You put it through the micro pin through, so you don't use the big
Yeah.
pins. You use a
Yeah.
micro pin, and then a little strip of plasters out, and then you pin into the plasters out, and then your main pin with your labels goes through the other end of your plasters out strip, if that makes sense.
Yeah, staging.
the biggest,
Yeah.
the biggest thing we have in the collection is big fat pins straight through the thorax, and it's like, well, that's now useless.
Yeah.
So the smaller the pin, the better.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. And also, if you're collecting them in the field, this is just a little bit of a tip from my side. If you're collecting them in the field, and you just don't, if you don't put them in too big of tubes if you can, or if you do, then I put a bit of tissue in to force them to the bottom of the tube so that they can't beat themselves to death on the pot, because as they beat themselves around, they knock all their scales off and it's pain. There you go. Did you get that? Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. So, Julie Rose is asking for a list of literature. You put some book of the main titles on, didn't you, on one of the late slides?
Yeah.
I
mean, I can add that. Do you want me to put something in the chat? Is that something we can add later? I don't really know.
Yeah, or if there was any others, we could email them out.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Because there's some older books that may not be current but are always worth getting because they're fantastic. But yeah, we can do that. That's no problem.
Yeah, we can do that if that's all right. Thank you. Because the other question I had again was not really on about mosquitoes themselves. Your CO2 machines that developed in America that are attracting mosquitoes to help
The mosquito magnets.
Yeah, mosquito magnets. I was wondering what other insects that you might attract with them. Is it only the biting
Chelicoides midge? I've used them in Scotland, and the Scottish midge, I've filled bags full with like millions of them, and then that's you just get stuck. So yeah, other bitey things will generally be attracted. They're not particularly great. You might get the occasional other fly and things that just happen to be passing by and get sucked in, but unless they're attracted to the CO2. So it's quite good in a way because it's a discriminated way of sampling, so that if you're worried about accidentally killing other insects that you don't want to kill, then it's quite good in that respect. It's pretty discriminate, should I say, on bitey things. Yeah.
What about horseflies? Are you getting?
I know. I've never had many tabanids in it, to be fair. No, it's not something I've ever come across a lot of. Maybe occasional ones, but I don't know if they have different cues. I don't know.
Cool. Okay. David Hill is asking, have there been any phenological studies and changes with climate change?
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks, David. That is a good question. Actually, there's been some interesting finds with Aedes aegypti, which is the yellow fever mosquito, and that's another one that is on people's radar that they're keeping an eye on. That's been spread globally. It's seen as very much a tropical mosquito, but they've had instances in America, in Washington, where they started finding that they were appearing. They were there in the summer, and then they were there in the same place the following year, but they get exceptionally cold winters, and they couldn't understand how they were surviving. And what they were finding was that they were changing, modifying their behavior, and starting to exist in the subway, in basically in storm drains and things like that underneath the ground. So they were starting to find ways to adapt to colder climates, without knowing that they can't survive. If you think about it, if you're a mosquito that likes warm conditions and you're in a cold place, you go where the warmth is, right? And they're very adaptable that way. They also have had issues in Holland with the Netherlands, sorry, with them in greenhouses as well. So they're starting to, and Schiphol Airport have also had problems. So they're starting to adapt to find ways to survive over winter indoors in some places. They're still not establishing very well in the northern hemisphere, in the colder parts of the northern hemisphere. But yeah, there is some concern about behavioural changes, and how they're adapting to things like climate change. Yeah, worrying.
Yeah, these things find a way.
Oh, you Jurassic Park quote, I love it.
Okay. Oh, another question from Dave Balding. Are mosquitoes then attracted to warm bodies as well as CO2?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question actually. Yes, it seems to make a difference, because if you use CO2 attractants where it's a cold CO2, so it's not warmed, they do work, but they're not as efficient as the ones. So the mosquito magnet, because it ignites the propane, so it gives blasts of warm CO2. It seems to be a hell of a lot more efficient than CO2 traps that don't use that method of warm CO2. So there probably is some level of attractance there with warmth, yeah, but it's not 100% essential, but it obviously helps.
Yeah, with the tabanids again, we a few years ago, part of the survey for this rare Cheshire horsefly was putting up these Manitoba traps, and they're quite different. So they're just like having a big Swiss ball, like a big exercise ball, and they're black. And you just hang them up with it, and it's like a little trap above. What are the tent traps called again?
Or
Malaise.
the blaze traps.
Yeah, Malaise trap. So it's like a mini Malaise trap, like a hat on top of the ball. And the balls, they swing in the wind, so they're designed to move, look like they're moving, and then there's black. They heat up in the sun, and they're pretty they discriminate. Although we did get quite a lot of hornets as well. Not
Are tabanids attracted to different colours? Because I know blue. There's certain, is it tsetse flies are attracted to blue? Do tabanids have a colour attractant? I don't know. Erica
Tabanids
probably
go on
Sorry?
structure. They go on more structure. So it is like if they're bold patterns, so they can't see. So they've done all that lovely work now on the horses and painting cows in stripes, and it disrupts them. So they're very much about blocks. So the big black ball of the Manitoba is something they really like because it's a moving big black object rather than distinct colours.
So, Erica, is what you're telling me is that we need to get rid of our horses and just ride zebras?
No, yeah, oh, that'd be lovely. Or we should just walk around in camouflage, whatever you want. And it doesn't matter, like those pink camouflage that they sell to females, apparently, because it's whatever, but it's the disruptive color, so that may work as well.
Oh, zebra onesies coming out.
Yeah.
We should all do field work in those. We'll be fine.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Has anybody got any other questions before we say goodbye? No, I think that's it. Yeah,
Well,
that was.
thank you very much for having me. I do appreciate it. Been good.
No, it's been excellent. It's been a really interesting evening, Tom, and I appreciate all your work to put that together, as well as present it and ask and answer really comprehensively with all these questions as well.
That was my pleasure.
Yeah, brilliant. And of course, hope to see you in Liverpool again very soon.
Oh yeah, any excuse. Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Well, and thanks to everyone for coming, and hopefully see you at another Tanyptera event or in the World Museum Entomology Department very soon. Yeah. Thanks everybody, and good night.